So deciding between the iPhone 13 Pro and 14 Pro may seem simple because, I mean, the 14 Pro is newer, so it's gotta be better, right? Well, not quite, because the 14 Pro does also cost more money, like $300 to $500 more at the time of recording this video, which is certainly not better. So the question really becomes, is the 14 Pro worth the extra money? And well, kind of, because you see, when it comes to build quality, there's essentially no difference. The iPhone 13 Pro and 14 Pro both have stainless steel frames with probably the same Gorilla Glass on the back and ceramic shield glass on the front. I say probably because Apple doesn't mention which one they use, but either way, they're both good. They're also IP68 water and dust resistant, so they should be just fine for up to 6 meters underwater for 30 minutes, which, by the way, is better than the typical 2 meters underwater for 30 minutes of water resistance most other phones have. And both even look and feel pretty much the same, although the 14 Pro is 2 grams heavier, which isn't noticeable, but it's probably because it has a bigger and taller camera bump. And there is a good reason for that, which I will certainly get to, but this also means that you cannot use an iPhone 13 Pro case on the 14 Pro, but you also can't use an iPhone 14 Pro case on the 13 Pro because the camera bump is in a slightly different place, and so are the buttons. Typical Apple. But visually, the biggest difference you will see between these two phones is definitely on the screen. Yes, I'm talking about the dynamic island, but let's just ignore it for a second and focus on other things like the size, which is the same for both phones. Both screens are 6.1 inches diagonally, which is a good size, making them comfortable to hold, type on, and use with like 1.5 hands, at least for me. The resolution, however, is different. On paper, that is, because the 14 Pro has like 33 more pixels, which isn't noticeable if that wasn't obvious. What is obvious though is the brightness. The 13 Pro goes up to 1200 nits, while the 14 Pro goes up to 2000 nits, which is helpful in really bright conditions like using your phone directly under sunlight. So it's easier to use the 14 Pro, but it's not like you can't use the iPhone 13 Pro directly under sunlight. You totally can, and that's because 1200 nits, it's still pretty bright. It's just not quite as bright as 2000 nits. That's all. Other than that, both screens have great viewing angles, accurate colors, and they're nice and sharp with phenomenal contrast ratios due to them both being OLED screens. On top of that, both have variable refresh rates of up to 120 Hz. The difference is that the 14 Pro can go as low as 1 Hz, while the 13 Pro can go as low as 10 Hz, which means two things. One, potentially better battery life for the 14 Pro, which I will get to, and two, the always on display, which the 14 has. And it's nice. I have it turned on and I use it all the time. Mostly it just shows me the time, but if I get any notifications, they also show up, which is something I find very useful. But that dynamic island, yes, it's probably one of the least useful things the 14 Pro has. Look, it's nice. It's a new, fresh look, especially because iPhones have had basically the same notch since like 2017. So a little bit of change is welcome, and I certainly appreciate it. And while I did find myself using it sometimes at the beginning, I rarely use it now. So it's not something I feel like I cannot live without. In fact, I tested the iPhone 13 Pro after using the 14 Pro, and I did not miss the island once. So it's a cool feature, but I wouldn't pay more for it, especially because the island sometimes cut into whatever you're watching more than the notch. So it's worse in some cases. But when it comes to performance, that's certainly not the case, because the 14 Pro has a newer A16 Bionic processor, which, if you forgot, is exclusive to the iPhone 14 Pros. The normal 14s have the older A15 Bionic processor, which is the same as what this phone has. The only difference between this and the normal 14s is that their A15 Bionic processor has like one extra GPU core, which makes them like 18% faster, which is essentially the same. So this phone will perform just as well as the iPhone 14, the normal 14. And what's that performance like, you ask? Well, it's great. You will not notice any sort of lagging, freezing, or anything like that. It handles pretty much all graphically intensive tasks with no problem. Like, we're talking gaming, video editing, photo editing, and whatnot. But of course, the 14 Pro will probably be better at pretty much all of those things because it has a better, new, and more efficient processor. Although the difference here too isn't really noticeable. You might be able to see a small difference if you do like a side-by-side speed test, and if you really push both processors to their limits, then yeah, maybe you'll see the 14 Pro perform slightly better. But otherwise, in day-to-day tasks, you really can't tell, which makes the 13 Pro a better choice because it's cheaper. The one benefit you do get with the iPhone 14 Pro having the A16 Bionic processor is that this phone will get another year of software updates, which I guess only matters if you plan on using one of these phones for like the next 6 years or so, because the 13 Pro will still get software updates for the next 3 to 4 years at least, which I think is plenty for pretty much everyone.
Speaking of plenty, let me introduce you to this, the Nexode 300-watt charger from Ugreen. You heard that right. This thing can fast charge not one, not two, not three, but up to 5 devices at the same time. And because it supports Power Delivery 3.1 charging protocol, it can properly communicate with your iPhone, your iPad, your MacBook, and even most Android devices to ensure hyper-fast charging speeds without damaging them. This single USB-C port can output up to 140 watts, which is the same as the fastest charger Apple sells, meaning I can charge a 16-inch MacBook Pro from 0 to 56% in just 30 minutes, while charging my iPhone at full speed and 3 other devices at the same time using the other ports. This allows me to go from all of this to this. And on top of that, this thing is resistant to fire, bumps, and drops, so safety is not a concern. I've been using Ugreen chargers for a long time and never had any problems. So check it out using the link below. And thanks to Ugreen for sponsoring this portion of the video.
Now, since we are on the topic of charging, what's good is that none of these phones are better or worse because both can charge at up to 27 watts, which compared to Android phones is pretty slow, but compared to other iPhones, this is normal. But the iPhone 14 Pro has a 3200 milliampere battery and the 13 Pro has a 3095 milliampere battery. But does that translate to better battery life on the 14 Pro? Well, with the 14 Pro, I was able to get around 7 to 8.5 hours of screen on time with a lot of usage, but this did not include using stuff like 5G, Google Maps, or even using the cameras a lot, which are things that tend to use a lot of battery. But on the other hand, with the 14 Pro, I was getting around 6 to 7 and sometimes around 8 hours of screen on time with similar usage. So in this scenario, while the iPhone 14 Pro did last longer, even with the always-on display turned on, what I didn't tell you is that the 13 Pro has 90% battery health compared to 100% on the 14 Pro. So in an ideal world, if both phones had the same battery health, I do think they both will last for about the same time. But realistically, you will most likely find 13 Pros with around 90% battery health and 14 Pros with a little more. But even then, both of these should be fine for pretty much everyone. But where things really start to get interesting is when we compare the cameras, because this is where you'll find the most differences. So the iPhone 13 Pro has a wide-angle telephoto and an ultra-wide-angle camera, which can also be used as a macro camera, but all of them have 12 megapixel sensors. The 14 Pro also has the same cameras with the same megapixels, except the main wide-angle camera, because it has a 48 megapixel sensor, so it's 4 times bigger. And this one difference results in many smaller differences, like image quality. Photos from the 14 Pro certainly look better. They're slightly sharper, and it seems like they have a bit more dynamic range, which results in an overall better looking photo. Although you do have to look carefully to see the difference. You don't see it immediately, even if you have both phones side by side. Same with low light photos. They are better on the 14 Pro, but you do have to look carefully to see the difference. Ultra wide photos, however, are pretty much the same from both phones. But things change a lot as soon as you start to zoom in. If you look at these photos shot at 2x zoom, one looks quite a bit better than the other. The ones from the 13 Pro aren't as sharp and they have this weird digital look to them. But the ones from the 14 Pro look like perfectly normal gray photos. And that's because of the bigger sensor that the 14 Pro has. Even if you go to 3x zoom, the 14 Pro still looks slightly better. But in this case, it's not because of the 48 megapixel sensor. So I'm assuming it's because of a better image processing algorithm. Speaking of which, I did notice that the 14 Pro almost always has slightly better colors. They're a bit more closer to how everything looked like in real life, which is sometimes more noticeable in skin tones. Both phones do also have the ability to shoot RAW photos, and this is where the 14 Pro really shines. It's actually miles better. Just look at the amount of detail it has. This is what I would call a pro camera as far as smartphones go. These are just impressive. So if you're into photography, this phone's for you. And you're also going to like the fact that the main camera lens has a 24mm focal length compared to 26mm on the 13 Pro. In terms of video, you'll see the same trend. The 14 Pro is a bit better and has more features like cinematic mode, in which you can record at up to 4K 30 versus 1080p 30 on the 13 Pro. And while both phones have stuff like portrait mode, photo styles, and even ProRes video, you also get action mode on the 14 Pro. So yes, it's pretty clear when it comes to cameras, the 14 Pro is better in many ways. But if you just ignore this phone, the cameras on this phone are not bad at all. they're actually really good too. And for other things like battery life, screen, performance, build quality, honestly, there's not much difference between these two phones. So for me, it's honestly easier to recommend the 13 Pro just because it is cheaper at the end of the day. But of course, like I said, if you really care about the cameras and maybe some of the other bells and whistles, then you kind of have to go with the iPhone 14 Pro. And if you do, you also get the new crash detection and SOS via satellite feature as a bonus, which is nice. Now, if you're leaning towards one of these and you want to know more about it, I've made full dedicated review videos for both of these phones. So check these out and I'll see you there.